born from a different, they survived in a very different way. My grandmother was a child of Tehran. She went in a ship of orphans from Poland to Israel in the very beginning of the war. She lost her parents. My other grandmother was hidden in a cellar for 630 days and nights. And she would tell me the story of when she was liberated, coming up the steps and having to relearn how to walk and having to relearn how to speak out loud because she spoke in whispers for 630 days, which is just, you know. And then both my grandfathers were in armies fighting the Nazis. So, and one grandfather saw his mother and his sister being shot by the Nazis, and the other one, when he came home from the war, found that his whole family was gone. So I kind of grew up with that in my DNA, and I know you did too. If you want to talk a little bit about your family history, how you kind of found out.
I mean, my family history is in this book. Although it's funny, just talking with Keren now, we shared a glass of non-alcoholic wine at the wine bar two doors down. I really have started feeling just today this "don't kill me, husband." This responsibility to go back and really fill in so much of the book, because this book was created because my father showed me one letter that he and my mom wrote in the camps when I was a teenager. He'd barely spoken with me about the war. And I said, "This is fascinating. Do you have others?" And he goes, "Maybe somewhere." And then in the attic, where I always had dreams about Nazis as a child, he found this plastic bag of 130 letters. And it took me 7 years to have the courage to slowly, one by one, pour through it, word by word, in a language I don't really know, with dictionaries, and then asking relatives questions. And it became this, and I gave it to my parents as a family, so we could have it as a family archive on their 40th wedding anniversary, with no thoughts of ever having it published. And friends of theirs encouraged that to happen, and it did. And I was so happy that they got to have the documentary about them made well into my dad well into his 90s, my mom in her late 80s. And it premiered at South by Southwest Film Festival, and Ted Sarandos was one of the producers. And they really came out of their shells in such a beautiful way, and I got to witness that and participate in that. And one of my parents' dear friends' daughter is good friends with Keren, and she suggested to Keren, when she knew she was coming out here, that we pair together to talk about love in the most horrible of places.
Yeah.
And I want to hear everything, because I haven't heard the story that you haven't heard either, about how Keren found the story, how she brought it to the New York Times, and then decided to turn it into a. If you look at the back of this book, she cites, there's pages and pages of her research and where she had to go to find the information, because Sibby, the female lover, was not alive anymore when she wrote it.
Yeah, I had this background of this family history of survival, and I've always been interested in learning about new beginnings, people who have lost everything, refugees who, you know, lost their homes, their families, everything they owned, and had to start life with nothing. I've always been interested in stories about that. And I was actually writing about billionaires for Forbes for a great portion of my life. And before that, I wrote about sewage. So I've kind of been all over the place. So I decided in 2013, when we started hearing about, you know, the biggest refugee crisis since World War II, that I wanted to write about refugees. And I started looking into stories about refugees who came into the United States around World War II, and their stories of starting over with nothing. And one of the first stories I found was about this little girl called Bella, who was the first person to get a visa from Berlin into the US after World War II. And she was 3 years old. And she was kind of plastered all over the newspapers in New York City, and the New York Post, Daily News, New York Times, everywhere. This cute little 3-year-old coming into the US, walking down the tarmac, and this American soldier who adopted her. The story was that they kind of, you know, laid eyes on each other in this orphanage in Berlin. And she went running to him, and he had a bar of chocolate, and she was like, "Give me the chocolate," and they fell in love. And he spent more than a year just working through the bureaucracy to try to bring her over, because it was a time when Americans didn't want, strangers here. They didn't want to have, European children here. And it was just very difficult to get a visa to come to the US if you didn't have the sponsorship, especially from family that knew you. But eventually he did get her and brought her in. So I found the story through the archives, and I was wondering, what happened to this little girl, Bella? So I started researching and trying to find her. And by that time, she was 2018, I think. I was thinking, she's probably in her 80s, 70s maybe. And I finally found her. It took me a year, and she was in New York, and it was a very long search. She'd, gotten married, changed her last name, and she changed her first name. She wasn't Bella anymore. She was Ruth. And she was open to speaking to me. And when I met her, she had the little hat that she'd worn in all the pictures in the newspapers. She had pictures, and she had this huge box of documents that the soldier had corresponded with, his sister and different people, and they'd kept everything kind of like your parents did. And so anyway, long story short, she gave me the box and told me, have at it. And I went through the box, and I discovered that the story was not at all what the newspapers had reported, that it was all a front. The soldier getting the little girl, he never intended to adopt her. He was adopting her, he was bringing her in for someone else. But the optics of it in the newspapers, seeing the American soldier bringing the little girl, helped, bring her in. So the optics were a little better. And that's in the pictures in the newspaper. You see his wife, who, by the way, became his ex-wife within 3 months of him coming back to the US. She sent him a Dear John letter when he was still in the army. She's getting the little girl in the picture, but then immediately after the photographers are gone, she left, and his sister came and whisked her away because she was the real person taking the little girl. So I found the story, and it became my first story for the Times. And then after that, I was kind of hooked. I wanted to find more stories like it. And someone suggested that I speak with this guy, David Wisnia. And so I went to meet him, and he told me this crazy story about growing up in Warsaw, being this happy-go-lucky Jewish kid who loved to sing and dreamed of one day singing in the opera in the United States. And then, of course, the Nazis came in and everything turned upside down. And long story short, he found his parents and his entire family in a pile of corpses in the Warsaw Ghetto when he was 15 years old, lost everyone. He was transported to Auschwitz, and he managed to survive Auschwitz 3 years, and through a bunch of different kinds of jobs. At first, he was just carrying bodies of corpses of people who flung themselves against electric fences. And then eventually he was singing to the guards. So he had this privileged position. So anyway, he survived Auschwitz for 3 years, and then he managed to escape a death march, and he ran into the American Army, and not just anyone in the American Army. He ran into the Screaming Eagles, which were, the top of the top. And this scrawny kid who was all shaved and had the tattoo from Auschwitz sees these American soldiers, which, as I said, he always dreamed of living in America. He sees these American soldiers, and they adopt him. They tell him, here's a uniform, here's a gun. They taught him how to use the gun. And they said, you're one of us now. And he joined the Americans for the last 3 months of the war. So, and by the time he came to the US, he was in full American uniform. So he tells me the story, and I'm just kind of like, wow. I get up to leave, and he just kind of casually says, oh, and I had this girlfriend in Auschwitz. I sit back down and I had my recorder going, and I knew enough to not turn it off. You kind of learned that in journalism school 101, like never turn the recorder off. And so I was like, tell me more. And he says, yeah, I had this girlfriend in Auschwitz. We met while we were prisoners, and she was a very special prisoner. She was a graphic designer. And at this point, I'm kind of like, okay, I know enough about Auschwitz. You know, none of my grandparents were there or in a concentration camp, but I know enough to know that I don't think they were employing graphic designers, and I don't think people were going on dates. So he's in his 90s, so I'm kind of like, okay, I'll let him talk, and we'll see what happens. But then he shows me this book that had been written by this academic book by 5 different historians, each from a different perspective, telling Tzippi's story from when she was in Auschwitz, and she was interviewed by these 5 historians. And so, of course, on the train ride home, first thing I do is download the book. And I was reading it, and I just kind of fell in love with Tzippi after reading that book. She was just this fierce, woman who just, she knew what she wanted, and she went for what she wanted. She was 7 years older than David. I'll give you an example. When she was growing up, there's a story that she was walking down the street, and she saw someone painting a sign at a store, and she said, that's the kind of job I want. So she walked into the store, and she waited for the owner, and she said, I'd like that job. And the owner said, that's not for women. And she said, well, there's a woman painting the sign, so women can do it. And the owner said, yeah, no, that's my wife. She's helping me. That's not a job for women. And she said, well, obviously women can do it. She's doing it, so I want that job. And the owner said, well, you have to go to graphic school, and no woman has gone to graphic school in Bratislava, so you can't do it. And she said, I'm going to go to graphic school. I'm going to get my certificate, and you will employ me. I will work here. And she did. She actually went to graphic school. And there's a picture of her working, painting a sign. And it was in the local newspaper there. And she got a job with them. So that's just the personality she had. Long story. I told you I go on tangents.
It's all right. They're wonderful tangents. And she actually exercised her craft in Auschwitz, yes?
She did, yeah. She was able to be a graphic designer in Bratislava until she couldn't anymore. And she was one of the first, she was in the second transport into Auschwitz of women. And when she first got there, she was doing literally back-breaking work. She was carrying stones and building Birkenau. She was building Auschwitz II. And she broke her back literally when a chimney fell on her. And then she got sick, and because of her, her determination and obviously luck, because you had to have luck to survive too, she was able to kind of work herself into this privileged position where she started doing graphic design for the Nazis. She was basically drawing charts for them. I think she called herself a graphic designer, and they were like, sure, you're a graphic designer, but she was drawing charts with statistics about people coming in and going out. And then she proposed to them doing this 3D model of the camp, so that, when people came in from Berlin headquarters, they could see the model of the camp. And they loved the idea, but this also gave her access to go around Auschwitz, which is something that women didn't have. And in that way, she could just kind of have free access, because she could say she was taking measurements. She wanted to get everything right. She was also very, part of what her personality was, she was very a perfectionist. So she wanted to get everything right, but this gave her access to meet people, to be part of the resistance, which she was. She was creating documents and hiding documents, and she was
It's
giving.
another thing that the story has in common, that they
Exactly.
had access to pen and paper, and I was fascinated by how much she created and hid while she was there, because she wanted to be able to have proof if she was lucky enough to get out to show people.
Right. She wanted to bury the newspapers, or not the newspapers, the charts that she was doing of the statistics and everything, because she wanted to show that, this happened. And actually, you were telling me a little bit about your aunt, I guess, right?
Yep. My mother had a little sister. I mean, a half hour really isn't enough for Keren to tell the story of David and Sippy, because it's just, I mean, this should be a solo show. But my parents fell in love, and my father had a wife in the camps with him. And the odds of all three of them surviving, when 103,000 Dutch Jews were shipped out of Westerbork and only 3,000 came back, were ridiculously low. But because his wife at the time, who survived, and we all were friends after the war, I got to spend time with her and write letters with her. But my mom and dad found the real thing. And because my mom had access to pencils and paper in Bergen-Belsen, because she knew shorthand, and the Germans were trying to build a diamond factory, the Dutch Jews had the best knowledge of how to manufacture, how to cut diamonds, and they needed to learn that trade from the Jews so that they could kill them and the Germans could take over. And they actually had a set of factory, a whole factory set on a train track right outside of Bergen-Belsen, ready to come in. And my mom was brought in to take the notes for the Germans in shorthand at their 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. meetings about how they were going to structure the diamond factory. And so my mother would get my father pen and paper, and their messenger of love was her little sister, who lived in Beverly Hills. She survived, but she was very mentally damaged from the war. And I shared with Keren that I just found out a few weeks ago that she told a friend of the family that it was the only time in her life she felt useful, because she was doing something good, and she never found that purpose again after the war. So to have found a sense of purpose in the camps.
That's something that that's part of the survival, I think. You are also saying how your parents at first didn't want to talk about it. And it's interesting because David also at first didn't want to talk about it with his family. And the only way that his son found out was when he was getting his bar mitzvah. He suddenly asked, why don't I have grandparents coming? Because David perfected his American accent, so he didn't even realize that his dad was European. So around his bar mitzvah, he said, why don't I have grandparents? And I think he asked his rabbi, and the rabbi said, you don't know your father's story? And he said, no. So the rabbi arranged a meeting between David and his son in a diner. And that's when, with the rabbi there, that's when David told his son about it. Because David even went so far as to try to remove the tattoo from his forearm. And he showed me, and he still had, some of it on there. And he told me that it was the most painful thing he'd ever done. They literally cut it off and then put the skin back together. But he so wanted to move past that time in his life. But at the same time, it was like he was drawn back to it again and again. He kept going back to Auschwitz. He went back and he wrote his initials on the bunk. He carved his initials on a bunk. And he went back with his family right before he died. He was already very sick and not in great shape. He was in his 90s, but he really wanted to bring his family back there to the anniversary. I think it was the 75th anniversary. And I think part of it was to show, I'm back and I have a family, and Hitler didn't win. And I think he also felt this urgency toward the end of his life to share the story.
My father always called his family his victory against Hitler, but my mom called us her revenge. Do you do a spoiler alert when you talk about the book and how they meet again, or do you have to?
Well, I mean, they meet again, but so much happens that
I know, but I have a feeling
I don't think it's a real spoiler. Yeah, I mean, it's on here that they reunited after 72 years. Yeah, and they because of a series of things, they ended up not being together after the war. But he did go to see her, and she was in Manhattan. They were both in the Northeast towards the end of their lives in the United States. And he went to her deathbed, basically, and he took his grandson and his granddaughter with him. And he'd always wondered, I survived 3 years in Auschwitz. How is it possible? Most people survived 3 months. And okay, I was a privileged prisoner because I sang to the guards, but still, David was not an angel. And he'd done plenty where he'd gotten into trouble. He was in the penal colony in Auschwitz, and people didn't come out alive from there. And yet he did. And he always wondered, how did that happen? And finally, toward the end of his life, he got to ask Tzippi the question. And his grandson was telling me about this reunion. He said that he was really worried when he was taking his grandfather because he didn't know what shape he'd find her in. He knew that she was bedridden. She couldn't really see, she couldn't hear, and she had 24-hour help taking care of her. And when they first got there, she didn't recognize him. And then David kind of leaned in and said, "It's me, David." And his grandson said that her eyes just kind of lit up, and she was like, "David." And they started bantering as though they were still, teenagers. And she was flirting with him and saying, "Do you remember how pretty I was?" And at one point, and there's a recording of this, and she says to him, "Do you remember what we used to do?" And David's like, "Tzippi, my grandkids are here." So it's really, really sweet when they reunited, and he found out how she actually saved his life. And I won't spoil that, but yeah. Yeah, she's saved his life multiple times. And I think that also this connection that they had, that your parents had, when they go into a concentration camp, the first thing that they did to your parents too was shave everyone and, clean them and then give them these uniforms and basically, try to get rid of their identity, right? You're not a person anymore. You're not David. You're a number that's now going to be, printed on your arm. And when they connected, they became human again, and they were able to, find that humanity, find love, and remember what it was like to be a person. And I think that saved both of them too. And I know that in the letters, your mom said that.
Yeah. I mean, who knows? People survived, and people survived terrible things. They're but for the grace of whatever you believe in. But the fact that they were able to carry that spark with them through the war and even through their whole lives. And I just thought of this. Maybe there is something to Tzippi being older than David, because he was, in terms of it meaning in some ways more to her, and her holding that love for him all those years in a way that he had to push forward and live his life.
Yeah, I mean, people ask me that, and I think that, he was 15. He was 13 when the war started, when he and his family were in the Warsaw Ghetto. was a kid, you know, and he didn't get to have those teenage years and to be a kid. And then, and Sippy, meanwhile, was older, and she had a fiance, you know, before the war, and she had lived out her adolescence. And then she met David, and I think they were in different places. You know, after the war, I think he just wanted to be a kid. And his son kind of said that he's been like a 15-year-old since
Says nature.
yeah. Yeah.
So I'm sure he brought a lot of joy to her.
Yeah, I think, and also something else that we talked about was their love of music. Both of them. David loved singing, and when I met him, he would just break into song, and that was just the kind of guy he was. He was a singer by nature, and she grew up playing the mandolin. She was actually in a mandolin orchestra, and she loved music. And people who knew her, I never got to meet her, but she was interviewed by many historians who were incredibly loyal to her and who became like her family. They always talked about how she loved music, she loved singing, and they had this joy for life. And it was kind of a bizarre thing at the concentration camp where they had these concerts, you know, which kind of served as propaganda to make it seem like, you know, look, this is a place where there's music, you know, it's not a bad place, there's entertainment. For outsiders to think that it was a normal place, but at the same time, they were forcing people to be there. You know, they were killing people, and being in an orchestra, being an entertainer at a camp was also a way to protect yourself, because you became a protected citizen, or not citizen, a protected prisoner. And your parents wrote about going to concerts and that feeling of...
And looking forward to doing it, hopefully again in the future.
Yeah.
You know, it's so funny. I know in the Holocaust survivor community, there's some hierarchy. You know, how many camps did you survive? For a long time, people in hiding felt like imposters because they weren't really survivors of the war. Yeah. My husband's family, they survived the Blitz. Elie Wiesel told my husband that your family were survivors too. But in the hierarchy, I mean, Auschwitz, of course, Auschwitz-Birkenau was as bad as it can get. And when you read what both of these human beings went through and found in each other, it's, you know, Bergen-Belsen was no holiday, believe me. And I think still 80% of the inmates in Belsen died of hunger, starvation, and disease. But it wasn't an extermination camp, and they were constantly running as fast as they can to keep out of that line to the gas chambers. And it's so chilling.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think they both describe, I see your mom described this this feeling of guilt for enjoying the music and knowing where they were while they were enjoying the music. So it must have been incredibly difficult. I can't imagine. I mean, beyond everything else.
And knowing that the musicians, the orchestra, the people who played in the orchestra in Auschwitz, many of them got sent away, and there were new musicians that came in. There was no guarantee and there was no security. But to be able to hear music was inspirational.
Yeah. Yeah, part of I mean, in Auschwitz, being in the orchestra was more secure in a way because there was also a hierarchy of jobs. If you had an inside job, you got to be warm and you got more food. And if you were entertaining the Nazis, they wanted entertainment. So they would give you extra rations and they would try to keep you healthy. Whereas if you're outside carrying rocks and you know, they forced you to walk miles over to where you were working without your shoes, just because an extra way of you know, making you go through torture. And you wore next to nothing in the freezing cold weather. You know, they described these uniforms that used to belong to Soviet prisoners of war. And some of them still had blood stains and bullet holes on them. And so if you were outside, you didn't survive long at all. And once you weren't useful to the Nazis, they got rid of you. They don't want to spend their resources. Um, so,
And one of the women in the workplace where Sippy was carrying on with a Nazi, with a very horrific
yeah.
Murderer SS guy who was completely infatuated with her. So that's a whole nother exploration in here that I found utterly fascinating.
Yeah, there's a woman who Tsippi met as she was going into Auschwitz, who was at first completely hysterical on the way over. She was just screaming and crying and sobbing, saying, "I'm not a Jew, I'm not a Jew, I shouldn't be here, I'm not a Jew." And Tsippi went over to her and was like, "You got to shut up, you're going to get yourself killed." And eventually this woman ended up getting a high position with the Nazis. And she was kind of the head person at the camp. And she remembered what Tsippi did, basically saved her life in the beginning when she was losing it. And she helped Tsippi then get her privileged position as a graphic designer. And the two women together came up with ways to save other women, save men. They were able to do these little acts of resistance, like get extra underwear for prisoners who didn't have underwear, find extra food, or get someone who was sick an inside job so that they could, get better and not be taken away to gas chamber. Tsippi, wrote about how she had an office job, so she would bring people in and just have them write whatever, just pretend they're doing work so that they could, survive. So this woman, Katya, was very, very much a shade of gray kind of person. I mean, we all are as human beings, but she was dating this Nazi, but at the same time, when you're a Jew dating a Nazi, I don't think you have much of a choice. So I think it was complicated, and she was able to use it also to save people.
The humanity that they exhibited even in their privileged position, where they were still in so much danger, was really remarkable to me. I didn't know the level of those workings in Auschwitz, even though I knew about the uprising.
Yeah. I mean, in Auschwitz, what I found really interesting was the letters that your parents wrote each other were, they were long letters. They were meaty. And the letters that David and Tsippi sent each other at first were not even letters. They were like little scraps of paper with, a few words in there, because if they were caught with a pencil, they'd be killed on, tortured or whatever. So I was very interested in how they managed to do that. Were they worried of?
I think they were in different places at different times, and they were separated. A lot of these letters are written while one doesn't know where the other is. But in Westerbork, the first internment camp, they tried to make things look normal just so that they could use it as a way station to deport the Jews to either the death camps, or they were mostly sent from Westerbork to Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, some to Mauthausen, and Bergen-Belsen was the one camp everyone wanted to go to because they weren't cattle cars that left. And so in Westerbork, my father got a position being the principal of the school. And he had access to a typewriter. So the first letters were written via type, and there wasn't a penalty or a punishment for that.
And he actually apologized to your mom because he said, "I'm sorry, this isn't romantic because it's not handwritten."
And they could bring a satchel of their own things, so everything wasn't taken away from them. It was a very small bag, but I'm sure they had. My aunt kept actually a little agenda, a tiny diary book, all through the years there. I have no idea how she got one for 44 and 45. And we have them, and I digitized them in the last few weeks. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of Tzippi's great regrets was that nothing that she saved and stowed away was found. Nothing. And the historian who edited the book, where she spoke about Auschwitz, said that he looked everywhere, and it must be in some Soviet archive or something, or it was
They
destroyed.
just found 9,000 books that were looted in Auschwitz, and they've been able to reunite them with 2,500 family members.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
I hadn't heard that.
That's a story that's trending right now.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I mean, even the 3D, mock-up that she had created, she was so proud of that, because she even got the camp mechanic to do little light, to put light posts in there so that it lit up. She was very proud of her work, but at the same time, that mechanic came in. He was in the resistance, so he was helping her build this mock-up, but also they were giving each other information and helping each other. So all these little things I found as I was doing research, and the historians who interviewed her, one was in Australia, he's in the Holocaust Museum in Sydney, one in DC, they're kind of all over the place. They were in such awe of Tzippi because she was, total badass. and she was tough. If someone walked into a room and didn't know something, she would say, okay, you're not serious. You're not a serious person. I'm not going to talk to you about Auschwitz if you haven't done your homework, if you don't know the basics. So she was very, she was not an easy person, but she was meticulous. And she left behind a ton of testimony and interviews and documents. But the ones that she really wanted people to find from the camp, she wasn't able to find.
Maybe you will.
Maybe. I mean, now that you told me that, be on the hunt. Yeah. I met this writer who wrote a book about the album. Have you heard of the album of Auschwitz? These photographs were discovered from Auschwitz. Somehow someone had taken all these pictures, and he put it together and wrote, the context around it. And it was published. And she called him one day and said, I found a mistake. And he said that he was freaking out. No journalist ever wants to hear that. And he had mislabeled one of the barracks. It should have been 61, and he put 63. And she was like, you need to make a correction. How can you do this? You need to reprint the book. And he was like, yes, Tzippi. And that's just the personality she was. She wanted everything exactly right. And then they became really close, and he actually gave the eulogy at her funeral. So she was really tough on people, but she was also extremely loyal, and she just, once you were in, you were in. Yeah. I don't know if we kind of over. I know we're supposed to have some Q&A. I'm sorry, we're a little over.
Does anyone have any questions?
Are you going to read something from your books?
If you want me
It
to.
would be great to hear just a little something from each of the books.
Sure. Do you
Go for it.
Will you read something from yours too?
Sure.
Okay.
I'm going to be random.
All right. I'll read from the very beginning. They first saw each other at the sauna, and I'll just say the sauna is where they disinfected the prisoners' clothes. They called it the sauna because it was the warm place in the camp. So they first saw each other at the sauna, surrounded by piles of clothing. The air was thick and hot. They were in one of the few places that provided warmth during the unforgiving Polish winter. Here, workers submerged garments in steam kettles and watched smoke rise outside a window. Here, surrounded by worn, soiled rags, a boy and a girl met. He was 17 with a clean-shaven head and a round face. Despite it all, he was relatively well-fed. His striped uniform was neat and tailored, clean. Perhaps this was part of his allure. He stood out. In a world of stripes, you weren't supposed to stand out. You had to live by the rules, blend like shadows on the verge of disappearing. Sometimes at night, he was summoned out of his bunk to sing. His tenor was beautiful, operatic. It had once earned him an audience in his hometown. Here he remained a soloist, still a star of sorts. When she showed up, he could almost forget where he was. The sight of her gave him something to look forward to. At 4 feet and 11 inches, she was petite but sturdy, her legs muscular, her face wide and angled, framed by thick chestnut hair that was still growing in. From a distance, she seemed unassuming, easy to ignore. Up close, she was anything but. Her deep-set eyes, brown like his, were sharp and alert, but she had an easy smile. She moved with a self-assurance that was rare in their milieu. His eyes on her, he felt a flutter. A girl was looking at him. Her glance lingered, he was sure of it. And here it was easy to forget that his old world still existed, a world of possibilities, promises, of desire. When he saw her, he remembered. She wasn't supposed to be there in the all-male part of the grounds, yet she'd made a habit of getting herself into places where she shouldn't be. She was 25 years old and she knew what she wanted. She'd been like this as a young girl and hadn't changed in all the years since. If anything, her tenacity had only grown. It wasn't that she believed in taking unnecessary risks. In a world of chaos, she craved structure and order, logic and reason. But this place had a way of making you do what you least expected. It had a way of making life-threatening risks seem reasonable. Perhaps because here, nothing was reasonable. She had her escape, her art, and yet she was alone. The boy across the room had a pleasant face. He seemed sweet, eager. Something about him made her want to come back, made her reckless. It was wintertime in Birkenau, the largest and deadliest camp in Auschwitz.
And I just opened to one. June 7th, 1944, 8:30 p.m. My dearest Inika, just a few words from my bed. Remember, darling, be smart and don't get sick. We just can't have that here. If it happens, I will have to violate all strict rules and set foot in Barrack 17, exclamation point. Everybody is all excited about the invasion. And of course I am too, mostly because at moments such as this, our futures become tangible. I, of course, had my dreams before, but everything seemed so far away. Now it is as if our chances are closer at hand, and along with that come all the optimistic thoughts that I have for a happy future for both of us. Do you feel that too, darling? Maybe it is extra good that we feel that way because it will get harder for us by the day with the success of the English. I had a small example here today at the shoe factory, where you could feel the Germans' lousy moods. But it is especially then that my ties with you make it so much easier to carry on. I'm dead tired, so only these few thoughts for you. Sleep sweetly, be all healthy tomorrow. Much love and kisses, your Jaap. And that's still, it's June 44, and they wouldn't be leaving the camp till April 45. So a lot of waiting, a lot of anxiety.
Okay, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
You have one question?
Can I just ask a question? I guess I was just a little interested in your writing style and that how you approach the writing, because it seems like it would almost, I'm not even sure if it's a cathartic experience for you, but you're really telling this incredible story about your history. Could you speak to a little bit about like how you approach it when you're writing? Do you write in bits and pieces, or do you find that you just it kind of flows out of you?
Well, I had to do a ton of research because I wanted it to be nonfiction, and I didn't want to I didn't want to put any fiction in there. So I did do a lot of bits and pieces. That the beginning just, I think, was in one seating, and then I edited it, but a lot of it came as I was doing research, and I'd read something and so much I was surprised by that I just couldn't believe happened. And so I would write, a new scene. I was also thinking about it as scenes. I wanted it to be a book that read like fiction, because I didn't want to write a history book. I wanted it to be something that new generations can connect with. I feel like often when we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about numbers. 6 million were dead, and it's hard to connect to numbers. So I wanted to make the two people come to life and the people who were around there come to life. So I guess it took me a while to write it because I wanted to put in so many details to bring it to life. Yeah. And then I revised it a million times.
What is your next project? You don't cover any contemporary refugees situations or?
So I'm working on two different, very, very different things right now. One is a whimsical children's book that has nothing to do with World War II. And another one is my grandfather's story about after the war. He wanted to find the Nazis responsible for killing his mother and his sister. And so he found them. Yeah.
Okay. We have lots of folks up here. I'm sure they'd be happy to sign them for you. So thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you.